So our main goal today, we have a couple of them and I'll go over them with you. Our main goal today is to educate our audience on sleep itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about sleep science, which is the cool stuff for us. Because we can't change what we don't understand, particularly as behavior analysts, but as practitioners and parents. If we don't understand what's happening, it's really hard for us to change it. So for parents, we're hoping you come away with some tangible tools to support your children so that they can sleep better, your adolescents, as well as yourself if you're here for yourself. But chances are if your kids aren't sleeping, you aren't either. So we'll tackle two at once. We're going to go through a few case studies. That's how we're going to talk about the different sleep problems. So we're going to illustrate them through case studies. If we had a live audience, which I don't think we've yet presented with since we started doing this, at some point we'll be able to have some interaction. We'll be able to do some live case studies. But for now, we're going to review some that we've already done. So we're going to go through a few case studies, touch on the sleep issues and strategies. For professionals, the information we share here hopefully can help you support those that you serve. We are going to talk a little bit about what that looks like from our perspective as behavior analysts, not too much, but a little bit. And then maybe even tackle your own sleep, because chances are, as an adult, you may have some sleep habits you need to tackle as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about specializing and what that means. And I do this for two reasons. As behavior analysts, we should practice what we know. We know that. And behavior analysis itself is one tool in a bigger toolbox among many tools that we can use to support others achieve healthy sleep. To gain competency in this area, we know that we need to do a few things, and we've listed those here in the circle. Why this is important is because our ethics code has been revised and a new code is coming into place in January 2022. And it places a really heavy emphasis on competence and making sure that we have the competence in the area in which we are working and the population with which we are serving and supporting. So first would be a literature review, not just in our field. So it's important to look at literature relevant to sleep. That would be medical journals, it could be nursing journals. There's a journal called Sleep. That's a great one to look at if you can find it. We look into literature on child development, parenting, education, all sorts of resources. Also books. Books are great. There's a great book by Dr. Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep, and that's an amazing book that talks about sleep itself in a really relatable way. So if you're able to pick that up, I highly recommend it. Also things like podcasts, webinars, trainings such as this one to get a better idea of the sleep science and how it can be used within a framework to support healthy sleep. So that's the training aspect of things. And next would be mentorship. So that kind of completes the loop, is making sure that we're seeking out mentorship in the area in which we're going to be practicing. So that could look like somebody supporting you with case conceptualization, somebody coming in and supporting you in a case perhaps in a topic you haven't done before. Maybe it's a more complex sleep case. That's what we did through our journey. I think it was about 2 years of reading everything we could get our hands on, attending anything and everything we could on sleep, and then seeking out a mentor. And we worked with that person for a little while, and that's also why we offer mentorship now, is to help others develop competency in this area. It is such an important part of daily life, and it's really important we have all the information we need to support those that need it. And it's also helped us with our own personal habits, which we'll touch on a little bit. So why tackle sleep? Well, for those of you that are sleep deprived, you know exactly why you tackle sleep. We're going to touch on it a little bit and go into it a little bit more detail. When we are sleeping, we know we aren't at our best. Interestingly, though, we don't always know we're sleep deprived. So we may feel like something's off, but we don't always relate that right back to sleep. Our goal here is to normalize healthy sleep, not just for our kids, but for ourselves as well. It's okay to tackle our kids' sleep if it means we're sleeping better and we're able to do better. That's an okay thing to do. Everyone, I'm sure, at some point, I was going to say in this room, but I should say the audience as well. Everybody at some point has probably, quote unquote, worked the midnight oil, has at some point pushed past the yawning, pushed past that wall that they hit to get the thing done they need to get done, whether it is finishing a project, finishing up a PowerPoint, maybe it's cleaning the house, which would be me. I need to get the cleaning done so I can wake up in the morning and have a decent house. We push past all of that to get those things done that are important to us. And it often doesn't occur to us to actually prioritize sleep first, that really should be the thing that we tackle first so that it can help us tackle all other things. We don't often celebrate healthy sleep. It's pretty rare for someone to walk into a room and say, I had a great night's sleep, everyone. Fell asleep right away, woke up naturally, it was great. Most often we hear complaining about poor sleep, much like I did, I think, during our mic test. Let's talk about how poor my sleep was last night. So it's really important to normalize healthy sleep. And that's a big piece that we push and talk about. At the end of the day, sleep is the foundation upon which all other pillars of health sit. And there are many pillars of health. We've just listed 3 here, but depending on what you look up, there's a bunch. So as parents, we deserve to sleep too. That might mean sleep training. And as professionals, we should be asking about sleep right away when we start working with those we serve. We need to be asking how sleep is, because to tackle sleep would mean all other things will just go better. We'll be able to retain information, learn, attend, all of that fun stuff that makes learning easier. So sleep is really the first thing we should be tackling. A quick note about sleep training, because I know even for myself, when I first had my oldest, hearing sleep training would kind of raise my hackles a little bit. Little alarm bells go off, because we often equate sleep training with cry it out or with distress. And I think it's important to recognize that there is actually no set definition of sleep training, that it really depends on who's speaking, their history, and how they define it. Sleep training can mean many different things. So to make sure we're talking about the same thing, I'm just going to quickly touch on what it is for us. Sleep training is not any one method or approach. It isn't any one thing that we do. Sleep training is about education. It's about learning an individual's needs. It's about working alongside a family or individual to achieve their sleep goals. And I'm going to place an emphasis there on their sleep goals. It isn't for us to prescribe a plan. An expert model is usually not a great idea with somebody who's already sleep deprived, and you're asking them to do a hard thing, and sleep training can be hard. So the expert model probably isn't the best way to go. We want to make sure that we are the resource, that we're providing the information and expertise so that we can all work together to come up with a plan that's feasible and sustainable, and that is in line with a family or individual's values and what's important to them. So that's our blurb on sleep training. So we're going to get into the sleep science of things, which is the fun part. How long should we sleep? So you'll notice here we do include babies all the way up to 18 plus, teenagers, etc. So before 5, kids typically nap. Typically, I say. Well, I think both of mine cut theirs out at around 2, but typically, this is when naps would be cut out. So when you look at a total duration for kids that are napping, you want to include the nap plus the nighttime sleep as a total. So if they need about 14 hours sleep and they slept 2 hours for a nap, chances are they're going to do 12 hours at night. So you want to include both of those numbers. It is a range, and that's important to note. Some people can handle the lower end of the range, and some people do better with the longer end of the range. Usually, if you're going to assess somebody's kind of natural sweet spot for sleep, you want to observe their natural sleep cycle without interruption. So you want to pay attention to those cues. When are we seeing sleepiness? When are they, not that kids usually ask to go to bed, but when are they wanting to go to bed or go to sleep? And when do they naturally wake? So sometimes that means just watching a natural pattern for a little bit, just to get a sense of how long does somebody need to sleep to wake up rested and alert? And that's the key piece. Waking up on your own typically means you've gotten enough sleep, and waking up rested and alert typically means that you've gone through all the sleep that you need and all the sleep phases that you need. I'm sure you've heard people boast that they can get by on 4 to 5 hours of sleep, or maybe you think this about yourself. There's a very, very, very tiny portion of the population that can function on less sleep. But most people that sleep less aren't actually the exception. The danger of sleep deprivation is that we don't often know when we are sleep deprived until we're sleeping again. And now we realize, I have more energy, I'm more alert, my memory is better, I have a better appetite, etc. So most of us do need all the stages of sleep, and we do need all the hours of sleep that we need. We're going to talk a little bit about those phases of sleep and sleep architecture. So you notice this is from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. So this would be a typical adult night's sleep. So for kids or teenagers, for kids, you kind of extend it a little bit and extend the phases a little bit. But generally speaking, through each cycle, we go through the different levels of non-REM sleep and REM sleep. Each stage has a benefit, so we need all of them. So it's important that we're hitting all the cycles of sleep. And as you can see, they're about 90 minutes each. So we go through each one within 90 minutes. Non-REM has several stages. And you can see in each one, there's a bit of non-REM followed by REM sleep. And they do a bit of a dance through the night. Non-REM sleep is basically what weeds out any unnecessary neural connections and helps you retain that information. So it's kind of the cleaner. It kind of removes some of the stuff that you don't need. REM is what comes in and solidifies and strengthens any new neural connections. So you can see why that dance kind of happens through the night. REM is critical for mental health. It's critical for managing emotions and strengthening those new neural connections, that memory. So anything that you learn through the day is typically solidified through the night or with a nap. A nap sometimes will do the trick too if you can get through all of the sleep cycles. You'll notice through the cycles that the majority of REM sleep occurs in those last two phases of sleep, those last two cycles. So about 80% of your REM sleep is between 4 to 7 a.m. or in the last 2 to 3 hours of your sleep. This is important to note because it's not uncommon for us to be woken by an alarm. We typically need to be somewhere, so we set an alarm. Maybe our kids have school. Maybe you're a teenager and you have school, and so you need to set your alarm to get there on time. If you're not waking naturally, that typically means you're dipping into one of those two cycles of sleep, which means you are reducing the amount of REM sleep you get in a night. And like we talked about, that can really impact your day. That can impact how you're retaining information, how you're attending to information, your general mood. You may be a little bit more irritable. For those with teenagers, that may all sound very familiar. But unfortunately, school systems are not set up to support the natural sleep cycle of teenagers, which we're going to talk about teenagers in a case study. So there are certain variables in your day that can result in your sleep architecture shifting. Getting light first thing in the morning, within the first 2 hours of waking, even just opening up the curtains, going and sitting by a window, that has been shown to increase the length of time and the intensity of your deep sleep, which is really important because that's your restorative sleep. So there are things you can do during the day that will fine-tune your sleep cycles at night.
So the next part we're going to talk about is two processes that work in tandem to ensure our bodily systems are in sync. So every cell in our body, every organ system has its own clock, and if they're out of sync and they're not working together, then that's when problems start to arise. One of the mechanisms that is in place to keep our body on a consistent clock each day is something called our circadian rhythm, also known as our body clock, or in this graph, it's process C, the red line on the bottom that has a very consistent wave. This clock runs at about just over 24 hours a day. So this clock was first identified by some scientists who were wondering, why do we sleep all the time at regular times? And they did some research. They went on a journey into a cave where there was no external light that would cue them to fall asleep. They found that they were hungry around the same time every day. They wanted to sleep at the same time every day, again, with no external cues available. So what they discovered is that our clock is on a 24-hour, 15-minute schedule. So when they stayed there for multiple days, they started to move forward in time. which I find very fascinating. And also it's very interesting, it's very important to know about this when developing sleep plans and understanding that our bodies naturally want to fall asleep a little bit later each day. So this is why it can be so hard to push bedtime earlier. So some people who want to wake up at 5 a.m., they do the math, they want to go to bed at 9, but find it nearly impossible because you can't shift your body clock earlier by an hour in one night unless you're very, very tired. So this will be important to keep in mind as we go forward. Second on the graph, you have that blue line there. It's called your sleep drive. And this one is our sleep pressure, so that urge to fall asleep. So the blue line on the graph coordinates with that circadian drive and its timing of the release of a neurotransmitter called adenosine. Adenosine starts to build up from the moment we wake up this morning, or in the morning. Mine has already started. And it increases over the day so that you get a higher level and all of the receptors are full. That's when you start to feel that urge to sleep and that wall starts to come up. And it feels like pressure, which is something we work with when working with plans and trying to figure out where everyone's circadian rhythm and where their sleep pressure drive is. Usually you can barely keep your eyes open at that point. Again, hopefully I can't see an audience, but I'm going to imagine there's an audience here. And I'm sure everyone's felt that pressure to just fall asleep if you're staying up late, pulling an all-nighter to study if you were in university, all those things. Last night I felt it as I was reviewing this presentation. I stayed up a little bit too late. So when it comes to adenosine, there are two very significant variables that can impact the level of adenosine in our systems. So the natural production and that natural flow. The first thing are naps. So as soon as you have a nap, that allows adenosine to be removed from the system. So it starts to clear it out a little bit, and you feel less tired when you wake up. That pressure to sleep might go away. Naps can then shift the blue peak a little bit later, so you might feel tired later. The second thing is caffeine. Caffeine blocks the neurotransmitter sites for adenosine. Are we good? Just checking. We have some movement. Okay. Caffeine blocks the neurotransmitter sites so the body doesn't feel the sleep pressure anymore. Although the adenosine is continuing to build, even though the caffeine is there. So when the caffeine wears off, the adenosine starts to come back full force and binds the receptor sites, and the sleep wall will return. So hence why people start to have multiple cups of caffeine to make it through the day. You start to avoid that feeling of sleep pressure. Rule of thumb when it comes to naps and caffeine. Naps if you need one because you didn't sleep well, that's okay. Try to keep it under 90 minutes and earlier in the day to allow your body to continue to build up that adenosine. And then for caffeine, making sure that you're timing it correctly. So if you do want coffee in the morning, and we talked about this earlier before the presentation, try to keep it before lunchtime, or if you feel that your body needs a lot more time to process caffeine, then you might keep it earlier. Again, the half-life of caffeine is 5 to 7 hours. So being mindful of that and doing a little bit of math to make sure you can still get your cup of coffee or tea in the morning. Okay. This next slide we always include because we love it so much. It gives a good depiction of how caffeine can actually impact our neural functioning and our ability to plan, attend, and basically executive functioning of a spider. But the spider on this graph was injected with various drugs. You got LSD, speed, marijuana, and then caffeine. And if you compare the webs to a normal web, the caffeine web is the most disjointed. So really understanding how caffeine, even though we choose to use it, it still is a drug, and being mindful of how we use it in our day. Okay. Melatonin. This is a common word that comes up all the time when we're supporting families with sleep. Melatonin supplements are very common, and we're going to go into that a little bit later and talk about that. But for now, we're just going to define it a little bit and give you a clear picture of how melatonin works naturally in the body. Melatonin is a hormone that's naturally produced by the pineal gland in our brains. So during the day, melatonin levels are quite low, and you can see that on the graph. It's basically at 0. And it starts to peak in the early evening, about 2 hours before bedtime. And it's not high, but you start to see it slowly going up. It stays relatively high overnight. So in the middle of the night at 3, 4 a.m., that's when it's at its peak. And it starts to level off and then drop really low when it's time to wake up in the morning. When melatonin starts to rise, this process is called the dim light melatonin onset. Self-explanatory by the name, but as light begins to dim in the evening, melatonin starts to be produced. So light is the key variable when it comes to producing natural melatonin. Our body doesn't produce a lot. It doesn't need a ton to be able to start to see or start to trigger that process of going to sleep. If you try to go to bed before the dim light melatonin onset, you're likely going to be laying in bed and not feeling tired because it does take around 2 hours for it to start to reach that peak where you do start to feel tired and ready to fall asleep. This is where insomnia can start to happen if we start to spend too much time in bed, too much time awake, and then we have a problem going on. As I said, light plays a critical role in the production. Blue light especially has melatonin blocking effects. If the bright light exposure is done during those 2 hours before bed, so if you're watching a really bright TV, maybe you have your sun lamp on or you have all the lights on in the house, you will definitely block the melatonin production so that peak won't start until later. So until the lights go down, that's when the peak goes up. Another strategy is dimming the light in the evening. And I've done this I wanted to experiment myself and see if it would help me fall asleep earlier. Again, life happens, so I can't do it every day. But trying to live by candlelight for a night and see if you do start to feel tired earlier. Because there's no blue light frequencies in candlelight, which is, so it's the optimal lighting. And there actually was a case study done by an author, Linda Giddis. I don't know if I said that right, but she did something with her family. She just lived by candlelight for, I think, a week or maybe longer. Other families thought she was insane for doing that. But she found that her kids settled earlier, she settled earlier, and everyone's bedtime was just basically earlier and sleeping better and deeper. She found that her children were much calmer, and there was some significant results that she noticed. And her work was inspired by her research in the Amish community. So understanding how electronics and how screens have actually maybe shifted our healthy sleep. And our bodies have not had a chance to evolve yet to that exposure. So again, we live in a world where bright light is available 24/7. If you go to Vegas, they have the perfect lights to keep you awake all night. So there's that science to it. So we can manage the light easily and our exposure to light, and that's one of the most simplest ways to help that natural melatonin production. When it does come to supplements, like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but consultation with a doctor is extremely important. Melatonin is tough to know how much melatonin is in someone's system unless you're doing like a blood draw or, and it has to be like in the moment. So that's something that you can speak with your doctor about. So for melatonin, we have another system, another hormone that can impact our ability to have healthy sleep. Cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And I'll talk a little bit about this and how like the pandemic may have adjusted all of our cortisol, I would say. It's been a very stressful time the last 18 months. And so understanding how cortisol can impact our sleep is important. Cortisol is that stress hormone, and it's produced by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which also helps control our sleep cycles, so they work together. If the HPA axis is disrupted due to chronic stress, poor nutrition, or illness, then sleep disturbances can follow. Understanding how cortisol works can help with understanding where sleep may be impacted. Cortisol, again, it has its own rhythm, just like all of the other hormones we have talked about and the systems we've talked about. In the graph, you'll see 3 different levels. You've got the top one, which is the high range. And so that's very much where stress, I guess the cortisol level is quite high. And then you've got the lower range. And being right in the middle on that blue line is where you'd like to be. It begins to rise around 2 to 3 hours after sleep onset and continues to rise into the early morning. So it is highest when we're waking up. The peak in cortisol is around, on this graph, 9 a.m. And as the day continues, it declines. So you want cortisol to be low before bed so that your body is ready for rest. If cortisol is too high, activation of our systems can cause alertness and will occur and can impact the ability to settle into sleep. So personal stories, if I open my emails and there's an email in there that will stress me out, possibly a spike in cortisol, so it takes a little while to unwind from that, and my sleep probably would get pushed later. So hopefully that was a nice summary, and we can clarify if there's any questions, but understanding how these all work together can really set up the environmental changes in those sleep plans.
Sleep and neurodivergence, so we're going to touch on this a little bit. When we talk about competence and sleep treatment, it's really important to keep in mind that we have a responsibility to understand those we serve, not just understand the sleep science. Neurodivergence can mean many things, and each of these are tied to different strengths, and you can see those listed in between in the overlaps. I myself identify in the mental health area. I have anxiety, I have depression, I had postpartum anxiety and depression, and they still linger. So I understand from that perspective through lived experience the impact that has on my sleep and how important it is for me to look after my sleep. And so I'm in a little bit of a better position to speak with those that also have anxiety and also have depression. However, I don't identify as autistic. And so when we are supporting individuals with autism, it's really important that we are working alongside them, that we are ensuring we understand their individual needs, all of their sensory needs, how they experience the world. And we do that through talking with parents and talking with them directly. And it's really important that we move away from an expert model when it comes to sleep treatment, and we're really focusing on the family and the person in front of us. When it comes to what the research tells us, we can talk a little bit about the physiological components, because there is research telling us that there are some biological concerns and variables that we need to take into account. And these all speak to what ultimately sleep might look like for an individual that does perhaps have some of these components that are impaired in their sleep cycles. So Nicole went through the various components of sleep, so I'm just going to tie it in a little bit to what the research tells us about autistic sleep. So typically the research tells us that autistic individuals may have an atypical or a weaker circadian rhythm. So what that would mean is that their cues for wake and sleep are a little bit weaker. They may not, their sleep cycles may not kick in when they should, and their wake drives may not kick in when they should. So part of our sleep plans usually do ensure really salient cues for wakefulness and really salient cues for sleep. There also may be lower levels of melatonin, so they may have a flatter profile instead of that rise starting in the evening, peaking, and then coming down from the morning. So there may be overall a flatter level, and that's where additional melatonin could be helpful, just in terms of providing that peak. But you would need to identify first that there are actually lower levels of melatonin, because not every individual would have lower levels, and you can do that through a blood, urine, or saliva analysis. And that's best done with a doctor, of course. We also know the research tells us there tend to be higher daily levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So a bit more alert, which would make it more difficult to do naps. It could also make it a bit more difficult to settle at night, and that's something we need to keep in mind as well. So supports in place for bedtime and settling would need to really take into account we could have higher daily, higher cortisol levels, which means that's not always in our control, but we can work with other professionals and we can come up with ways to calm that system, to calm the body down and get it ready for sleep. We also know that there may be some impaired REM stages. So anywhere from 30 to 50% less REM sleep than neurotypical counterparts. And we know that REM has a lot to do with emotional regulation, has a lot to do with learning, memory, and attending, as well as just in general moving through your day with a nice flow, because we know that when our mood is a little off and when we're irritable, our days don't tend to go as well. So those areas may be impaired as well. There's also some neurotransmitters that are related to sleep cycles that are impaired. So those would be the cues, your brain telling the rest of your body, it's time to get ready for sleep, or certain other cycles kicking in. So there tends to be, for example, a drop in temperature. That's one of the things that cues our body it's time for sleep, is our internal temperature drops. And so if that cue doesn't occur on top of lower levels of melatonin, our sleep drive is less likely to kick in. So those are just some important areas to consider, and that's where it's really important to understand sleep, but also understand the neurobiology behind it, so that when we are designing plans, they aren't just environmental in nature. That's not always going to fix it. We need to understand the individual themselves, what's going on for them, and how we can adjust accordingly.
We know that sleep is important, and we've talked about that, and we're going to be talking about that all day today. It can impact our quality of life, children's quality of life, learning, immune system, memory, all of those things. So let's get one thing clear. Sleep deprivation is common across all ages, children, teens, adults. Since starting this journey to sleep, I have also realized that sleep is not just a pillar of health, but the foundation of health. Before learning about sleep, I used to focus on my food and what I was eating, exercise. I'd say mental health was probably next, and then sleep was last. I would never have thought about tackling that piece for me. And without sleep, all of the efforts of those that I was doing with exercise, food, mental health support, I wasn't seeing the progress that I needed to see. So again, we're going to go into some side effects. Let's look at this next piece. So we're going to look at mood and how does sleep impact mood. And so emotion regulation, self-regulation is a very common goal within, I'd say, a lot of programs and with people. We just want to make sure we're all calm, happy, and relaxed. And if we're not sleeping well, that can change. So when we accumulate sleep debt, which is when we have multiple nights of sleep deprivation, and this can be an hour. Sleep deprivation doesn't have to be, I only slept 3 hours last night. It can be just 1 hour less than your normal. We can start to experience significant side effects in our ability to regulate our emotions, as well as move through our emotions and move through experiences that we have. So in a study done by Segir and colleagues, they found that sleep debt accumulation can lead to an increase in anger, impulsivity, and anxiety. There are many biological reasons for this, which I do not have the scope to understand this. I think I only have intro to bio and human anatomy, so I'll leave that up to the experts. But understanding how sleep can impact our mood and allow us to shift our lens a little bit, and understanding if we're not sleeping well at night, maybe we need to adjust the expectations for the day. Less demand, don't expect independence when it comes to emotion regulation. There might be more support in that area. There is a significant correlation between sleep and mental health. And we'll tie that into when it comes to teenagers, because I also experienced this as a teenager when I wasn't sleeping well, had to get up early for all the things. And if sleep isn't present, then mental health might start to crumble. Okay. Next, we'll go into the physical health side of things. So a study was completed that looked at the relationship between sleep and physical health. And I think sometimes this gets ignored as sports and physical activities are usually scheduled, especially for kids, later into the evening or really early in the morning. I used to get up at 5:45 or 5 o'clock to get into the swimming pool for swim practice, and now I look back and I'm like, oh, maybe that explains a lot of things. So sleep has a profound impact on how our body heals and protects itself from the daily physical needs, especially in athletes. So a study found that adolescent athletes who sleep less than 8 hours a night, so the average for adolescents I think is 9 to 11, have greater risk of injury. Again, our sleep works at the biological level to repair tissue damage, muscle growth, and so much more overnight. So you can imagine if you're not getting enough sleep, then your body's not able to repair, and putting it through that extensive physical activity and movement, you're more likely to get injured. So this is a good anecdote for any athletes out there. Now, like I said, sleep is a common problem. There's an epidemic, they've called it, of sleep, and understanding this and kind of normalizing that there are many people struggling with this can be helpful. A Canadian Health Measures survey was completed. It was a bit ago. I think they could definitely update one. But they found that 1/3 of adults are not getting enough sleep to support their mental and physical health. Second, the CDC looked at high school students, and 2/3 of high school students are getting less than the recommended amount for their age. And there are many barriers to this, to getting enough sleep for teens, and we'll go into that a little bit more later in this presentation. But a lot of it comes down to timing of expectations. So again, teenagers start doing sports, they have to go to school earlier. And I would say the times of school starting continue to get earlier and earlier. I think I had to go in for an observation in a school in Chilliwack, and the start time was 8 a.m. and I was mind blown by how early that can be. So lack of sleep is an epidemic, and it's been going on for years, and it continues to go on with the societal structures that we do have in place. So that 9-to-5 work week, the commuting, which maybe has gone down a little bit, but I still think there's still commuting going on, and many more barriers we're not getting enough sleep. And that can lead to development of chronic health conditions. Things like asthma, obesity, arthritis, cancer. I'd say lack of sleep is, I'm trying to recall, but it's it's a carcinogen, so it can lead to issues later on. Okay. Sleep and COVID-19. With the pandemic starting, there were many factors in place that changed the way we do things every day. And our daily routines were turned upside down, broken, we had to readjust, and now we're kind of coming back to readjusting again. So while that sleep epidemic was in full swing before the beginning of COVID-19, the research shows that it got worse. There was an increase in sleep problems for children around 40%. And so you'll see on this slide, there are many contributing factors to this. One would be reduced exercise. We weren't really allowed to go anywhere. Kids didn't have school to go to. They were moving less. They're moving their bodies less. Increased screen time. And this was due to increased expectation of going to online learning, which had to happen, occupying their time because their parents had to stay home for work, and sometimes screens are the only way to get them to just sit still for a little while you get things done. And that just needed to happen. No judgment there. And we know from the research that screen time can impact sleep significantly. It can also impact a lot of other things like brain structure and all of that, but we're not going to go into that today. Things like video games, computer use, mobile device use, so on social media more. Personal experience, I found myself on screens a lot, trying to gain an understanding of what is happening in our world today and trying to make sense of it. And social media was definitely one that I was scrolling a lot. And it did impact my sleep. I'd say my sleep shifted from being pretty normal to waking up at 4 a.m. every day because I was worried about what was going on. So when it comes to screens, the more interactive forms of screens can impact sleep more, and it reduces total time asleep and delayed time to sleep in comparison to more passive activities like TV. However, both kinds can still impact it. Bedtime routines changed with the change in the daytime routine and the schedule. Meals were likely different. Exercise, school, all of our routines went out of whack. Physical and emotional well-being took a toll. And again, I think everyone can kind of relate to this. Their children are probably more stressed with the change. Adults are stressed with the change. I can only imagine what it was like to come home or stay home and have to work if you have kids, especially kids who need more supports. The anxiety and fear was high, and there was very little support in the community to adjust. And so when it came to childcare and support and flexibility and everything, that was out the window. So, yeah.